Hi everyone! This video is about making ATP with or without oxygen, otherwise known as an introduction to aerobic versus anaerobic processes. We'll define both of these terms later in the video, but let's start with a general review of what you've already learned about cellular respiration. So as you know, the first phase of cellular respiration is glycolysis, which takes place in the cytoplasm. In this process, one glucose gets broken into two molecules of pyruvate, and NAD also picks up hydrogen ions and high-energy electrons to become NADH. Along the way, a little bit of ATP is produced too. After this phase, those pyruvate molecules enter the mitochondria, where they go into the citric acid cycle. In this phase, more NAD comes and picks up more hydrogen ions and electrons to produce more NADH, and another carrier, FAD, also picks up hydrogen ions and electrons to become FADH2. A little bit of ATP is made here too. The final phase of cellular respiration is the electron transport chain. And this is the phase in which all of those high-energy electrons and hydrogen ions are brought over from NADH in glycolysis and the citric acid cycle and get dropped off. The same is true for FADH2. It drops off its hydrogen ions and high-energy electrons to become FAD. Those electrons get passed along the electron transport chain, and they use the energy from the electrons to pump hydrogen ions. At the end of the electron transport chain, oxygen is the final electron acceptor. After those hydrogen ions flow through ATP synthase, lots of ATP is made, so this phase has the highest ATP yield. At the end of all this, these NAD and FAD molecules are now ready to go back to the citric acid cycle and glycolysis to pick up more hydrogen ions and electrons from the next molecule of glucose that comes through. Now, because this process requires oxygen, it's referred to as aerobic. So aerobic processes are ones that require oxygen. So this whole process would be called aerobic respiration. Let's take a closer look at exactly what oxygen does. As you learned in class, oxygen acts as the final acceptor of electrons in the electron transport chain. So here we are at the inner mitochondrial membrane between the mitochondrial matrix and the intermembrane space. And here you can see the different proteins involved in the electron transport chain. So to begin this phase, NADH and FADH2 arrive and drop off their hydrogen ions and electrons. The electrons are picked up by the proteins and enter the electron transport chain, and each time a protein gets a new electron, it's able to use that energy to use active transport to pump a hydrogen ion across the membrane into the intermembrane space. Each protein is a little bit more electronegative than the one that came before, so the electrons get passed through, and each time a protein gets an electron, it can pump another hydrogen across the membrane. At the end of the electron transport chain, oxygen there is waiting to take those electrons. It's very electronegative, so it keeps taking each electron as it comes through the electron transport chain. And we need a new oxygen every time they come through. So oxygen helps by pulling those electrons through the electron transport chain and taking them away at the end. After this happens many times and all these hydrogens have been pumped, we end up with a pretty strong hydrogen ion gradient. And the only place they can flow back across the membrane down their concentration gradient is through ATP synthase using facilitated diffusion. As they flow through, it turns a rotor inside ATP synthase, and phosphate gets forced back onto ADP, producing ATP. And also a little bit of water is made too. So the role of oxygen is super important here because it has to be there to accept these electrons so new electrons can keep coming through the electron transport chain to pump hydrogens, have them flow through ATP synthase, and keep making ATP. So a constant supply of oxygen in this process is critical for continual recycling of ATP. But what's going to happen if the cell runs out of oxygen? If this oxygen goes away, what's going to happen? Well, yeah, there's not going to be any water made. That's not super important. But it also means that this electron here has nowhere to go. It gets stuck at the end of the electron transport chain. Because this protein here already has an electron, the electron in the previous protein also has nowhere to go. It gets stuck too, and the same is true for the previous electron. Now, since these proteins already all are holding electrons, NADH and FADH2 are now unable to drop off their electrons also. So everything kind of gets backed up. The electron transport stops. Now, when that happens, each of these proteins can no longer pump hydrogens because they need to keep receiving new electrons in order to keep pumping hydrogens. So if they're just stuck with the same electron the whole time, the hydrogen pumping stops. No more pumping of hydrogen ions across that inner mitochondrial membrane. But these hydrogens here can still flow through ATP synthase down their concentration gradient. At a certain point, it's going to go to equilibrium because enough of them are going to flow through so that the numbers are equal on either side of the membrane. And when that's the case, no more are going to flow through, the rotor will stop turning, and no more ATP is going to be made. So at this point, ATP production in the electron transport chain would stop. Your cells need a lot of ATP for everything that they're doing, so if this happens, the cell or organism may die. So there are indeed many cells and organisms that cannot live without oxygen for the reason I just described, and they are known as obligate aerobes. So these are cells and organisms that can only produce ATP using aerobic respiration, and they'll die really quickly without oxygen because they can't make the ATP they need to survive. The classic example of this is brain cells. Your brain cells use a lot of ATP, and in order to make it, they have to use aerobic respiration, so they have to have a constant supply of oxygen. And if they are without oxygen for even a short amount of time, these brain cells are going to get damaged and potentially die really quickly. This is why someone can be what's known as brain dead. If a human body goes without oxygen for a little while, maybe someone stops breathing, or maybe they drown and they get pulled out a little bit later. If they go without oxygen for even a little while, your brain cells are going to be one of the first types of cells that are affected because they have to use aerobic respiration. They need a constant supply of oxygen, and without it, they can't make ATP. They're not going to be able to do all the things they need to do, and those cells can die. This is also why strokes can be so harmful. A stroke occurs when one of the blood vessels that leads to the brain gets blocked, often by a blood clot. And then the brain cells that are usually fed fresh oxygenated blood by that blood vessel run out of oxygen, they stop making ATP, and they can get damaged or die really quickly. So the rest of the body might be able to keep living, but those brain cells would die. And depending on what that part of the brain controls, whether it's speech or movement or balance, that functionality might be lost in that person if those cells completely die. So these obligate aerobes are cells and organisms that really, really need oxygen. But there are also some cells and organisms that can't live with oxygen, and they are known as obligate anaerobes, so without oxygen. These are cells and organisms that die if oxygen is present. And this sounds really strange to us because we always think of oxygen as being really good and beneficial and something you want a lot of. But oxygen is actually really electronegative, which makes it very reactive. And left to its own devices, it can go around stealing electrons from other molecules and causing all sorts of damage within a cell. Organisms that are designed to use oxygen like us, our cells have mechanisms to prevent this damage and repair it if it does happen, but not all organisms have this. So these obligate anaerobes, they can't be around oxygen at all. It's toxic for them, so they need a different way to make ATP, and a lot of them can perform a process known as anaerobic respiration. So they'll still carry out all the same phases, glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain, but instead of having oxygen at the end of the electron transport chain, they'll have a different electron acceptor. For example, it might be sulfur or nitrate or sulfate, depending on the exact species. So if we take another look at this diagram here, this was the electron transport chain for aerobic respiration that we saw earlier. In anaerobic respiration, the only major change would be that oxygen gets replaced by something else, maybe sulfur. It just has to be something else that's also really electronegative and kind of fit in that space. So who does this? Well, there are a few types of bacteria, a few types of archaea that do this. One example would be the bacteria that cause some serious infections such as botulism, tetanus, or a really horrible intestinal infection known as C. diff. And here's a nice electron microscope image of some of those bacteria. So these bacteria would perform this anaerobic respiration process. So now we've seen organisms that have to have oxygen, organisms that have to not be in the presence of oxygen, but there are still other organisms that are a little more flexible about the whole thing, and they are known as facultative anaerobes. These are cells and organisms that prefer to live with oxygen, but they can also survive without it. They can make ATP whether they have oxygen or not. Some examples of these would be yeast and also muscle cells. So here's an electron microscope image of yeast. Yeast is a protist. It's a unicellular eukaryote. It happens to be a fungus. And here is a little cartoon of some of your muscle cells, and we'll learn more about these in the spring. Now, what these cells and organisms do is they can alternate between different metabolic processes depending on whether oxygen is available or not. If oxygen is present, which they prefer, they will use aerobic respiration. So here with your muscle cells, if they have lots of oxygen, they'll use aerobic respiration, which makes lots and lots of ATP. But if no oxygen is available, if they run out of oxygen, then they can actually switch and use a different process known as fermentation, which we're going to cover in more detail in class. But this fermentation process does not produce quite as much ATP, but it can be enough for cells to get by for a little while in a pinch. So now you know why oxygen is so important in cellular respiration, and you know that not all organisms have to have oxygen in order to make ATP. In our next class, we'll take a closer look at the process of fermentation and how it works, as well as the different types of fermentation that exist. So until next time, take care of yourself, take care of each other.